Bevan Spencer von Einem, born the 29th of May 1946, is a convicted child murderer and suspected serial killer from Adelaide, South Australia. An accountant by profession, he was convicted in 1984 for the murder of 15-year-old Adelaide teenager Richard Calvin, the son of local television and radio personality Rob Calvin. Von Einem is currently serving life imprisonment. He was in G Block of Yatala Prison for decades but was transferred to Port Augusta Prison in the north of the state in 2007. The Good Samaritan von Einem first came to attention on the night of the 10th of May 1972 when two gay men were thrown into the River Torrens by a group of men believed to be police officers. The riverbank was a popular beat where gay men would meet covertly, as homosexual acts were illegal in South Australia at that time. One of the men, Dr. George Duncan, a British lecturer in law who had arrived in Australia only 7 weeks before, was drowned. The other, Roger James, suffered a broken leg and after crawling to the road was rescued by von Einem, who was driving past. Von Einem then took James to Royal Adelaide Hospital, where he recovered from his injuries. Criminal history. Murder of Richard Calvin. Richard Dallas Calvin, the 1st of December 1967, c. the 10th of July 1983, was the son of Rob Calvin, a popular and longtime television news presenter for Adelaide station NWS9. Calvin was murdered by von Einem on or around the 10th of July 1983 in Adelaide, South Australia after having been abducted, held captive, sexually abused, drugged and tortured for 5 weeks. Calvin was 15 years old at the time of his death. At approximately 6:15 p.m. on the 5th of June 1983, von Einem, likely along with other unknown persons, abducted Calvin near the intersection of Margaret Street and Pepper Tree Lane, North Adelaide, and was just 60 meters from Calvin's home around the corner in Ward Street. Calvin had just seen off a friend at a nearby bus stop on the corner of O'Connell and Marion Streets, North Adelaide after they had earlier that afternoon played football in a nearby park and was expected to return home immediately for dinner. A witness, a security guard living in Margaret Street, had heard cries for help, car doors slamming, and a car with a noisy exhaust speeding away. Calvin also had a dog collar in his possession which may have attracted von Einem's attention. Despite a wide-ranging search by police, extensive media coverage that included a full-page missing person poster in the Advertiser on the 28th of June, that unfortunately had contained a false lead given by the public to police, a $5,000 reward offered by the state government 2 days after his disappearance, quickly raised to $15,000 a week later, and numerous tips on possible sightings provided by the public in the weeks after. Calvin's whereabouts were unknown until his clothed body was found 7 weeks later by a geologist searching for moss rocks with his family on the 24th of July 1983 alongside a dirt airstrip near One Tree Hill in the Adelaide Hills area, to the northeast of the city and close to where relatives of von Einem lived. Little effort was put into concealing Calvin's body. He was found wearing the same Channel 9 shirt, blue jeans and white Adidas sneakers which he wore on the day of his abduction, together with a dog collar fitted around his neck. His body had been washed prior to being redressed and was found placed in the fetal position, with his legs bent towards his chest and his head forwards and his arms wrapped around his legs. This made police suspect that Calvin had been dumped by a single person, most likely after nightfall in order to avoid detection. The autopsy revealed that Calvin had most likely died from massive blood loss from an anal injury, probably caused by the insertion of a blunt object with a tapered neck, such as a beer bottle, and that he had suffered bruising and injuries from blows to his head, to the left side of his back and also to his right buttock, as well as a fractured front tooth which occurred either just before or just after death. Analysis of Calvin's bloodstream revealed traces of alcohol and 5 hypnotic drugs, Mandrax, Noctec, Amytal, Valium and Rohypnol. With mandrax being regulated by the Central Board of Health in 1978, stocks for it in Australia had declined somewhat by 1983, and police began sifting through prescriptions for that drug in particular. During their search they found a prescription for mandrax issued to a Bevan, Einem, a name familiar to police as he had been questioned previously over the deaths of 3 young men and the alleged sexual assault of another. 4 days after Richard Calvin's body was discovered, Von Einem was questioned by the police about the murder. He initially claimed that he had not seen Calvin and had no knowledge of his whereabouts, and stated that on the night of abduction he had been in bed with the flu and was off work for the next week. Police also searched his home in the northern Adelaide suburb of Paradise, and seized a bottle of mandrax. Von Einem admitted that the drugs were his and said that he used them to help him sleep. He denied having any other drugs in his possession, but police also seized a bottle of Noctec, concealed on a ledge behind his wardrobe. Von Einem also allowed police to take hair and blood samples, as well as carpets and other materials for testing. There were 3 major factors in Von Einem's initial questioning that led police to become increasingly suspicious that they had found their prime suspect. When police knocked on Von Einem's door and inquired about whether they could ask him a few questions, his immediate reaction was to say that he would not answer anything without speaking to his lawyer first. This made police suspect that he had something to hide. When questioned about the Calvin murder, rather than profusely denying any involvement, Von Einem simply said that he would not do such a thing because it would be unethical. This came across as a strange thing for an innocent person to say. When asked about drugs, Von Einem did admit he had mandrax. He was asked if he kept any other drugs in his possession, and he said no. However, the police then found the bottle of Noctec, and Von Einem immediately became nervous and told police that he rarely used those drugs. As Von Einem went on holiday to the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom during August and September 1983, the case against him began to mount up. Forensic investigators were able to match the many fibers found on Calvin's clothing to those taken from Von Einem's home, along with hairs found which matched those belonging to him. Forensics also determined that Calvin was murdered between the 8th of July and the 11th of July 1983 and was dumped at the airstrip no later than the 11th. However, police raids on various locations around Adelaide linked to Von Einem and his associates yielded few clues. Police also searched for a man who had previously claimed to police during the investigation of the unsolved murder of Alan Barnes in 1979 that Von Einem had been involved in his death and also that he was a former associate of Von Einem. Barnes's fatal injuries mirrored those of Calvin closely. The man, known as Mr. B, was located and informed police in great detail how he and Von Einem had picked up young male hitchhikers, had given them alcoholic drinks laced with hypnotic drugs, and had taken them to Von Einem's previous home in the Adelaide suburb of Campbelltown, where the young men had been abused overnight and released the next day. Mr. B also provided further information about other associates of Einem, but claimed he took no part whatsoever in any murders. Police also questioned other people whom Von Einem had associated with, but they volunteered little information. With enough evidence, along with the information given by Mr. B, to indicate that Calvin was at Von Einem's home around the time of his death, police arrested and charged Von Einem with murder on the 3rd of November 1983. Von Einem still denied ever coming into contact with Calvin. The committal hearing to determine if there was sufficient evidence for Von Einem to stand trial for murder began on the 20th of February 1984. Faced with irrefutable evidence from prosecutors that Calvin had been in his company, Von Einem suddenly changed his story to answer that evidence and admitted that he had been in contact with Calvin on the night of the 5th of June 1983. Von Einem said that he was driving along O'Connell Street in North Adelaide looking for a parking spot in order to buy some fish and chips for dinner. While looking for a parking spot in a side street, Von Einem said that he had nearly run over Calvin as he jogged in from his side. Von Einem stated he thought Calvin had bisexual tendencies and said that the two of them then had a conversation about problems Calvin had been having at school, and Calvin willingly got into the car and they drove to Von Einem's home. This answered the question of how fibers from Von Einem's carpet had got onto Calvin's clothes. To answer evidence about how fibers from Von Einem's bed had come to be on Calvin's clothes, Von Einem stated that the two of them had sat on his bed and played with a large gold harp which he kept in his bedroom. Police previously did see this harp in his room when they seized the drugs. Finally, to answer evidence about how fibers from Von Einem's cardigan had got onto Calvin, Von Einem stated that he had put his arm around Calvin and tugged him because Calvin was upset about how his peers had been bullying him at school. With all the fibers being accounted for with his new story, Von Einem concluded his statement by saying that Calvin had stayed for 2 hours before Von Einem dropped him off in the Adelaide CBD near the Royal Adelaide Hospital and gave Calvin $20 to pay for a taxi home. Despite the intricate details of Einem's alibi and his version of events, his story had two huge problems. It completely contradicted his initial statement of his whereabouts on the 5th of June 1983, when he said he had been in bed with the flu. Furthermore, the quantity of fibers on Calvin's clothes was far too large to suggest that Calvin was in his company for only 2 hours. Given these facts, on the 25th of May 1984, Magistrate Nick Manos ordered Einem to stand trial for the murder of Calvin. The trial against Einem for the murder of Calvin opened at the Supreme Court building of South Australia on the 15th of October 1984 before Mr. Justice White. A jury of 12 people, 7 women and 5 men, were selected and were agreed upon by the prosecution and defense. Einem pleaded not guilty, and his defense was led by Barrister Barry Jennings, who was assisted by Helena Jasinski, who had been Einem's solicitor from the start of the police investigation of him in the murder during the previous year. The prosecution was led by Brian Martin QC, later the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory, with assistance from Paul Rolfe QC, who went on to be Director of the Department of Public Prosecutions. For the prosecution, it was a matter of proving Einem's guilt, along with that of unknown persons, by presenting the strong scientific evidence that had been gathered during the investigation, and disproving Einem's story of being in contact with Calvin on the night of the 5th of June 1983. For the defense, it was a case of trying to make Einem's story hold up in court, and raising doubts about his ability to keep Calvin captive for 5 weeks and committing the murder. The prosecution opened their case with the jury being taken to the various sites around Adelaide that were important in the trial, and over the first week they called various witnesses to the stand. Calvin's parents, girlfriend and best friend were called to testify that Calvin was an average 15-year-old who would not willingly get into a car with a stranger, was heterosexual with no homosexual or bisexual tendencies, and that he had been wearing the dog collar as a joke. People living close to the Calvins then testified that they had heard noises and commotion corresponding to the abduction taking place on the night of the 5th of June at around 6 p.m. Forensic pathologists were called to testify about the injuries to Calvin's head and anus, and the likely cause of his death, and pharmacists gave evidence of the excessive amount of different hypnotic drugs which Einem had been prescribed. 5,872 tablets and capsules of 6 different brands of drugs between the 15th of December 1978 and the 10th of August 1983, and showed that Einem had often had prescriptions for drugs issued from 3 different chemists on the same day or during the same weeks. Various police who worked on the case testified to their investigation of Einem since they had first questioned him about the murder, as well as their visit to Einem's home where a police officer claimed that Einem's bedroom appeared to have been cleaned extensively. Forensic scientists were called next to give evidence first on when Calvin had died and when his body had been dumped in the Adelaide Hills area, and a leading entomologist claimed, from the larva cycle of flies that were on the body, and comparing these to the larva cycle of flies on a dead dog that was nearby, that Calvin's body must have been dumped beside the airstrip near Kersbrook on the 10th of July 1983. Other forensic scientists were called to testify about the hair and fiber samples collected that were linked to Einem himself and his home. Hairs from Einem were found on and inside Calvin's clothing, and of 925 fiber samples found on Calvin's clothing, 250 came from Einem's home environment, with just 7 from Calvin's home. The scientists stated that if Einem's story was true, then there should be a very small amount or even none of the fibers and hair samples from that night still on Calvin's clothing some 36 hours later, let alone 5 weeks later. Faced with such damning scientific evidence, the defense tried to counter this during cross-examination by floating a possible theory that after Einem's last contact with Calvin, he had been abducted by other people, who had stored his clothing for 5 weeks before murdering him and redressing him. While the forensic scientists conceded that this was a possible scenario, under renewed cross-examination by the prosecution, they conceded that it would be still unlikely given the whole science of how fibers and hair are transferred from surface to surface over time. The prosecution then rested their case. The defense opted for Einem to give an unsworn statement from the dock, rather than give sworn evidence from the witness box. In his unsworn statement, Einem detailed his alibi with what he claimed happened between the 5th of June and the 11th of July 1983. He again claimed that on the 5th of June he had picked up Calvin in North Adelaide, had driven him to his home, and later had dropped him off in the Adelaide CBD. He also claimed that he was sick with the flu for the next week after that and did not return to work until the 14th of June. Einem was quite sketchy on his activities after that, however he did remember what he did on the 10th of July, the day the body was dumped on the airstrip. He said that he was at a relative's birthday party with his mother for most of that evening, and after dropping off a friend on the way home, had gone straight to bed and then to work the next day. He also addressed the issue of the noisy exhaust on the car heard during the abduction of Calvin, by stating that the exhaust on his Ford Falcon, which Einem had sold on the 16th of July 1983, purportedly to raise money for his overseas trip, was less than 2 years old and in good condition. He closed his unsworn statement by again claiming his innocence. The defense then called various witnesses in an attempt to corroborate Einem's story. The witnesses included colleagues and friends who testified to him being unwell and at home during the first week of Calvin's captivity. Also testifying for the defense was the bushwalker, who while walking his dogs through the airstrip had discovered Calvin's body on the 24th of July. The purchaser of Einem's Ford Falcon detailed the condition of the car, and the relative who hosted a birthday party on the 10th of July stated that Einem and his mother had arrived there at 5:30 p.m. and left at 10:30 p.m. Photographs of Einem at the party were also tendered to the court. Finally, the defense called Einem's mother to testify about her son's activities over the weekend upon which Calvin was kidnapped. Under cross-examination, the prosecution were able to show inconsistencies in her current testimony compared to her earlier statements to police about Einem's whereabouts on the weekend before the 5th of June, which weakened the defense case considerably as this highlighted Einem's change the previous February of his account of what happened on the night of the 5th of June 1983. In their summation, the prosecution stated that the evidence they presented proved that Einem's story was full of lies and inconsistencies, and that he did murder, with the help of others, Calvin. They also stated that his admission that he had picked up Calvin showed that he was in contact with him on the 5th of June, that the fibers and hairs proved that Einem was with him at the time of just before and or at the time of death, and that the drugs proved Einem was with Calvin in between those times. The prosecution also answered the doubts raised by the defense about when on the 10th of July the body was dumped at the airstrip by suggesting that Einem could have dumped the body sometime very late on the 10th of July or in the early morning of the 11th of July before going to work for the day. The defense stated in their summary that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Einem was guilty of murder and also were not able to establish the exact cause of Calvin's death, so therefore the jury must give Einem the benefit of the doubt. Mr. Justice White then gave his summation of the trial, and in the early afternoon of the 5th of November 1984, the jury retired to consider their verdict. Verdict. After 7.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to give their verdict. Einem was found guilty of the murder and was automatically sentenced to life at Yantala Labor Prison. Mr. Justice White imposed a non-parole period of 24 years. Under South Australian law, a third of the non-parole period could be taken off for good behavior in prison. Based on this reckoning, Einem could conceivably have been eligible for parole in late 1999. The Attorney General of South Australia immediately appealed the leniency of the non-parole period, and on the 29th of March 1985 the Court of Criminal Appeal in South Australia increased the non-parole period to 36 years, a record at the time in that state. The earliest Einem could be released on parole was therefore on the 31st of October 2007, after allowing for the fact that a third of the non-parole period could be taken off for good behavior in prison. Einem's defense team, now consisting of Barrister David Peake with assistance from Helena Jasinski, appealed the conviction to the Court of Criminal Appeal in South Australia and requested that a new trial be set. The basis for this appeal was the evidence given about Calvin's heterosexuality, the references to Einem's own homosexuality through the trial and the negative impact that might have had on the jury, and also how Mr. Justice White in his summation did not include reference to the testimony given by Einem's relative about his attendance at the birthday party on the day Calvin's body was dumped. The Court of Criminal Appeal rejected the appeal, saying that the trial was conducted fairly and just throughout. However, they did concede that Mr. Justice White should have included the evidence relating to the birthday party. Additional murder charges. Einem was the leading suspect in the unsolved murders of 4 other young men between 1979 and 1982, and police continued to pursue leads on those cases in the years after his murder conviction. The 4 murdered were Alan Barnes in June 1979, Neil Muir in August 1979, Peter Stogneff in August 1981, and Mark Langley in February 1982. In February 1988, the state coroner at the time in South Australia, Kevin Ahern, ordered an inquest into the deaths of these 4 young men, and on the 24th of March 1988, the state coroner in his findings stated that manner and circumstances in which the 4 were murdered were very similar to that in the case of Calvin, particularly the murders of Barnes and Langley. The reward for any information leading to an arrest for the murders was increased to $250,000, and this was later increased to $500,000 in September 1989 and then to $1 million in March 2008. Following the inquest, police pushed on with their investigations and attempted to locate Einem's former associates to question them about the murders. During 1989, media interest in the 4 unsolved murders increased, with extensive news coverage in Adelaide about who was involved in the murders. The media dubbed those involved the family, an alleged group of homosexual child sexual abusers possibly involving high-profile Adelaide establishment figures, doctors, lawyers, judges and politicians, a theory that still persists to this day. Although the suspects do include several well-known members of the legal community, the brother of a well-known Olympian and other well-known members of the business community, police believe that the group does not include any high-profile people in Adelaide. However, fuel was added to the rumors of a conspiracy when on the 28th of August 1989, Einem gave his one and only interview from prison, given to the advertiser-journalist Dick Wordley. In the interview, Einem again pleaded his innocence in the murder of Calvin and of the 4 other young men, and regretted taking his lawyer's advice to keep silent during the early stages of the Kelvin investigation. He also hinted that he could name people that could help police with their investigation, but feared for his life if he did, and also claimed that his life was already threatened once by two police officers who ordered him not to give evidence in the inquest into the death of Dr. George Duncan in 1972. Shortly after Einem's interview, police interviewed Mr. B again, who was now living in Sydney. B gave a statement about the Barnes murder that convinced prosecutors to grant him immunity if Einem was brought to trial. Police, now with B's statement and the similar fact evidence from the Kelvin case, then arrested Einem at Yatala Labor Prison on the 15th of September 1989 for the murder of Barnes. On the 10th of November 1989, Einem was also arrested for the murder of Langley. Police were never able to obtain enough evidence for charges in the murders of Muir and Stogneff. In the case of Muir and Adelaide, Doctor had been tried for his murder in 1980 but was found not guilty. The committal hearing to determine if Einem should stand trial for the murders of Barnes and Langley began on the 5th of March 1990 before Magistrate David Gurry. Einem pleaded not guilty to both murders, and his defense counsel, now consisting of Barrister Mark Griffin with assistance from Marie Shaw, immediately claimed that it would be an abuse of justice for their client if he was ordered to stand trial given the mass coverage of the murders in the media in the past year. The prosecution was led again by Brian Martin QC, who was assisted this time by Tom Birchall, and their case against Einem relied on evidence of the Kelvin murder, with the details of the crime being so strikingly similar to the murders of Barnes and Langley. The prosecution's case also relied on evidence given by former associates testifying to Einem picking up boys, hitchhiking and sexually abusing them, as well as Mr. B's sensational evidence being in the company of Barnes and Einem at the time just before Barnes's murder. B also gave startling allegations of Einem being involved in the unexplained Beaumont children disappearance in 1966, as well as the disappearance of two girls at the Adelaide Oval in 1973. However, it turned out to be impossible to corroborate these allegations. Another witness also came forward to claim he had seen Einem and Barnes together drinking in the weeks before Barnes's death. Also entered as evidence were samples taken from Barnes's body which showed that sedative drugs had been present. Little evidence was presented for the murder of Langley, as prosecutors felt if they could prove that Einem had murdered Barnes, then it would naturally follow that he had murdered Langley as well. On the 11th of May 1990, Magistrate Gurry ordered Einem to stand trial for the two murders of Barnes and Langley. Einem's defense counsel appealed the decision, launching an abuse of process action in the Supreme Court of South Australia to achieve a permanent stay of proceedings, as well as stating that the huge media interest in the charges would result in their client not getting a fair trial. Proceedings began on the 19th of June 1990 before Justice Kevin Duggan, and 6 months later on the 17th of December 1990, Justice Duggan released his findings. He ordered Einem to stand trial, however he expressed concerns with most of the prosecution's evidence. The pre-trial hearing began on the 19th of December 1990 in the Supreme Court of South Australia, with Justice Duggan as the presiding judge. The prosecution decided after Justice Duggan's findings 2 days earlier to have Einem tried separately for the murders of Barnes and Langley. Justice Duggan ruled that the evidence relating to the Kelvin murder and from the various associates of Einem and hitchhikers was inadmissible, although he did rule that B's evidence could be heard, but with the defense allowed to question the evidence as it was being given. This was a shattering blow for the prosecution's case, and on the 21st of December 1990, on advice from the Attorney General of South Australia, prosecutors withdrew the charge for the murder of Langley. The prosecution tried to continue with the charge for the murder of Barnes, however, with the problems of getting enough evidence admitted into court from associates about Einem picking up hitchhikers to convict Einem still too great, the final charge was withdrawn on the 1st of February 1991. The prosecution, on the advice of the Attorney General, then entered the null prosequi for the Barnes murder charge. Later events. 2006. On the 29th of January 2006, the Sunday Mail reported that Einem was currently being investigated for allegedly raping an inmate several times at Yatala Labor Prison. On the 29th of October 2006, the Australian reported that Einem had been selling hand-painted greeting cards to prison officers for $20 each. On the 12th of November 2006, the Sunday Mail reported that Einem was receiving preferential treatment from some prison officials at Yatala Labor Prison, which included home-cooked meals for him and the use of a mobile telephone. On the 26th of November 2006, it was revealed that Einem had been prescribed Cialis by a prison doctor in 2003. 2007. On the 4th of February 2007, the ABC reported that Einem had been charged over commercial killings during his incarceration, including selling hand-painted greeting cards. On the 14th of June 2007, the ABC reported that Einem had been charged with producing and possessing child pornography, with police alleging that he had handwritten 3 fictitious stories describing sexual acts between a child and a man. His lawyer believed the handwriting analysis would clear Einem. On the 27th of July 2007, it was announced that Einem had been transferred from the maximum security B division of Yatala Labor Prison to Port Augusta Prison. On the 11th of August 2007, the Australian reported that detectives were calling for information to establish the identity of a young man seen in the 7 Network's news archive, showing police searching a stormwater drain in the days after the Beaumont children's disappearance. The man bore a striking resemblance to a youthful Einem. On the 13th of August 2007, the 7 Network followed this with a story that the man standing next to the Einem look-alike in their archive film matched the police sketch of the suspect seen with the Beaumonts at the beach on the day of their disappearance. On the 1st of November 2007, the ABC reported that after 24 years behind bars, Einem was now eligible to apply for parole. However, South Australian Premier Mike Rann had vowed to enforce new legislation to ensure Einem would never leave prison alive. On the 7th of December 2007, the ABC reported that Einem had been granted a further adjournment before answering charges of possessing child pornography. 2008. On the 25th of January 2008, the Advertiser reported that Einem would not answer charges of possessing child pornography for at least another 2 months. On the 28th of March 2008, the ABC reported that the child pornography found in Einem's cell had been determined not to have been written by him and that fingerprints did not match. Defense lawyer Sam Abbott said he expected the Director of Public Prosecutions to drop the most serious charge of producing the material and, if not, he would argue there was no case to answer. It was also announced that Einem had been excused from attending his court hearings so that he could avoid an unpleasant 3-hour drive with other inmates. On the 30th of March 2008, it was announced that key suspects in Adelaide's notorious The Family murders were being DNA tested as part of a new inquiry into the sex killings. Although Einem was the only member of The Family who was convicted, police were now reviewing the cold case. On the 13th of April 2008, it was announced that police conducting fresh investigations into the unsolved family murders would quiz transvestites who had information that could assist the inquiry. Some were former associates of Einem and were likely to provide valuable information into the inquiries. On the 27th of April 2008, it was announced that police were set to travel overseas to interview several key witnesses as part of their new investigations into the family murders. On the 4th of May 2008, it was announced that an Adelaide chiropractor who fled Australia while being investigated for involvement in the family murders was now being sought in Europe by police. He was a former associate of Einem. On the 6th of June 2008, it was announced that prosecutors had dropped one charge of producing child pornography. However, Einem was still facing charges of possession. On the 18th of September 2008, it was announced that prosecutors have dropped allegations that Einem wrote stories of child pornography in his jail cell. On the 28th of October 2008, it was announced police hoped one of 4 suspects in the notorious family sex murders would come forward to help solve the case after the state government had doubled a reward to $1 million. This announcement came just days after major crime detectives interviewed Einem from his prison cell. 2009. On the 27th of May 2009, Einem pleaded guilty to possessing child pornography, the first time he had ever confessed to a crime. On the 24th of June 2009, Einem was sentenced to a further 3 months for the possession of child pornography. References. Further reading: Bob O'Brien, Young Blood, The Story of the Family Murders, 2002, ISBN 0-7322-6913-X. External links: The Family Murders,